Hey everybody, today's video is about the waning days of World War II in 1945, discussing the Allies' plans for the post-war world, and we'll look at how those plans came to fruition in Europe as well as in the Pacific, and talk just a little bit about how World War II impacted America. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. In many regards, the post-war world was thought up and planned out at two conferences that were held in Europe in 1945. The first of those two conferences was held at Yalta, which is in the state of Crimea, and it was held in February of 1945, attended by what were known as the big three leaders of the Allied powers, and you see them there: Winston Churchill on the left, Franklin Roosevelt in the center, Joseph Stalin on the right. One of the things that was noticed by the people who were present at the Yalta Conference was just how gaunt and bad President Roosevelt looked. And indeed, he would be dead less than 2 months later. He wasn't doing terribly well and looks pretty frail there. At the Yalta Conference, though, a lot got done. The Allied leaders created what was called the Declaration of Liberated Europe, where they laid out what was to be done with not only Germany, but the areas that Germany had conquered after Germany finally surrendered. They agreed in principle that Germany would be split up. It was discussed that Germany should be split into separate nations after the war was over. President Roosevelt even put forward a proposal by which Germany would become six different countries, such as Hanover and Prussia, and I think Bavaria might have been one. But what they ultimately decided to do was simply occupy Germany for a period of time, and it would be divided up between the victorious Allied powers, the three there plus France. And we'll get more to that in a minute when we'll actually look at a map. Another contentious issue was what to do with Poland and some of the other areas of Eastern Europe that the Soviets had occupied as they marched towards Berlin in the last year or two of the war. In the summer of 1944, the Soviets set up a government in Poland that was supposed to be like their provisional government, but it was installed by the Soviet Union, and it was essentially a communist government. And Churchill and Roosevelt put pressure on Stalin to permit democratic elections once the war was actually over, and Stalin agreed, and Roosevelt and Churchill, beyond that, didn't press him much on the matter. And of course, Stalin does not allow free elections in Poland or in any of the other Eastern Bloc nations after the war is over in the areas they occupied, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, those areas. And so Yalta is often blamed, the shortcoming of Yalta in this regard is often blamed for the onset of the Cold War, in that Europe sort of ends up being divided by that so-called Iron Curtain. Additionally, the Soviets agreed to assist in the Pacific theater of the war once Germany was defeated. I think they said 2 to 3 months after the surrender of the Germans, the Soviets would get involved in the Pacific. And indeed they did on August the 8th, 1945, between the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union did declare war on Japan and invaded Manchuria in the first attempts to expel the Japanese from that province of China. The second of these major conferences in 1945 was the Potsdam Conference, which was held in Germany in July and into August of 1945. Two of the three principal leaders from the Yalta Conference changed between when the Yalta Conference ended and when the Potsdam Conference began. President Roosevelt died in April, so he was replaced by President Truman at the Potsdam Conference. And Winston Churchill was actually at the Potsdam Conference for a couple of days, but then while he was gone, there was an election in Great Britain, and his conservative government lost to Clement Attlee and the Liberals. So Attlee replaced Churchill very shortly into the Potsdam Conference. Stalin was still there. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allies formalized the occupation of Germany into four primary zones, which you see there on the map. The Soviets occupied the eastern part of Germany. The northwestern part went to Great Britain. The southern portion went to the United States, and then some portions along the southwestern border were given over to France for occupation. The Potsdam Declaration, which lays out the terms for Japanese surrender, was officially adopted at the Potsdam Conference, And the end of the Potsdam Declaration says that if Japan does not unconditionally surrender, they will face prompt and utter destruction. And that's sort of left open ended as to what that means, but it is seen by many as a veiled threat or reference to the atomic bomb, which was tested the day before the Potsdam Conference began at Los Alamos, New Mexico. So the U.S. knew at that point they had the atomic bomb at their disposal and would be able to use it. They also generally agreed that Japan would not be allowed to keep any of their imperial possessions, that their sovereignty would be limited to the home islands, and everything they had conquered over the course of the war would be occupied by the Allies for a time. They also created tribunals that would try Nazi war criminals, which began in the winter of 1945 into 1946. Similar tribunals were eventually held in Japan later on, like 1947, 1948 as well. After the Nazis surrendered on May the 8th, 1945, and the Allies occupied Germany, almost immediately the process went into place to sort of resurrect or reconstruct Germany. And part of that was a process that was sort of known informally as denazification, which is obviously a made-up word, but it referred to the elimination of Nazi references and symbolism from German culture and society in an attempt to sort of, wash that away as best they could. The Nuremberg trials, as I mentioned on the previous slide, began several months after the end of the war. 24 German leaders who had not killed themselves in the aftermath of the war were put on trial. Many were convicted. A lot of them served prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. 10 of them ended up hanged for war crimes. It was supposed to be 11, but Hermann Göring, one of the primary architects of the final solution, meaning the extermination of the Jews during the Holocaust, killed himself in his cell the night before being executed. So 10 Nazi leaders were hanged. The Allies also did a lot of, to use a kind of a crass term for this, harvesting intellectual property from the Germans. And by that I mean like their intellectuals, their scientific knowledge and research and things like that. The U.S. had a name for this. The code name was Operation Paperclip, but they recruited large numbers of scientists and engineers who had worked for the Nazi party apparatus and brought them to the United States. And in sort of some foreshadowing for the Cold War, the Soviets also very actively and very aggressively recruited these people. The most notable one that ended up in the United States was Werner von Braun, who was an aerospace engineer and was an early expert in rocketry. And he had developed the W-2 rocket for the Nazis, but he is best known in the United States for developing the rockets that took astronauts into space, including the Saturn V, which took our astronauts to the moon in the late 60s and early 70s. The Allies reformed the currency, replaced the Reichsmark, which was worthless after the war, with the Deutschmark, and eventually the German economy actually became very, very stable. Originally, the Allies planned to try to make Germany into like a pastoral, agricultural nation because they thought that after two world wars that Germany maybe could not be trusted with technology and mechanical big machinery and weaponry and stuff like that. But Germany thrived and became a modern economy that was a very important one in Europe and indeed the world. In 1949, the occupation by the Allies ended, but the Soviets maintained primary control over the eastern half of Germany, and it became two separate countries for 41 years, from 49 to 90. The western part there in blue was officially the Federal Republic of Germany. It was a democratic country. It was unofficially or colloquially known as West Germany, and the eastern part was known as the German Democratic Republic, or more commonly East Germany, and it was a communist nation, as I've said in this class before if you're one of my students. If the name democratic or people appears in a country's name, it is probably not democratic. The Japanese officially surrendered on September the 2nd, 1945, which was a little more than 2 weeks after they had announced they would surrender, and about three and a half weeks after the atomic bombings. The Allies divided up the conquered territory. Um, the U.S. occupied mainland Japan from 1945 until 1952. They also occupied the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula. Remember, Korea was a Japanese colony going back to 1905. And they also occupied the island of Okinawa, which the U.S. had taken over in the last days of the war in 1945. The Soviet Union got involved near the very end of the war, as I previously mentioned, and they occupied the Korean Peninsula above the 38th line of latitude, or the 38th parallel. China, who was one of the Allied powers in Asia, occupied Taiwan, and the United Kingdom occupied Hong Kong, as they had for most of the last century anyway. Douglas MacArthur, who was the hero of the Philippines, was the occupying general, you could say, in Japan. That's a picture of him there with Emperor Hirohito. As one of the sort of conciliatory gestures that the Americans made to the Japanese, they did not force Hirohito to abdicate. He was seen as sort of a unifying presence in the country, and he remained the emperor until his death in 1989. So he served as emperor for over 60 years. He was forced to revoke or renounce, would be a better term, his divine status, which the emperor of Japan was believed to have held. And Shinto was abolished as the state religion, official state religion of Japan. Japan adopted a new constitution in 1947 that basically renounced their militaristic past, and Japan becomes extremely pacifist, partially as a result of the shock of the atomic bomb that had obviously devastated the country and caused so much pain and suffering for so many people. Japan did not have a military for a long time. They do have today what's known as the Japan Self-Defense Force, or the JSDF, which is essentially a military, but it's officially an extension of the police force in Japan, and it's to be used for self-defense, to defend themselves against an attack. They do not, believe in offensive war anymore. They've more or less done away with the militaristic aspects of their society from the early 20th century. Japan becomes a fairly liberal democracy. They elect their first modern prime minister in the years after the war, and with American help during the occupation, the Japanese economy flourishes and becomes obviously very vibrant, as it still is today. After the war was over, the United States found itself in a position that very few countries in the history of the world had ever found themselves in, and maybe America was the first one to have this positioning on this scale, where they were this massive superpower that had wide leverage in the world as a leader. The U.S., embraces that role this time. They don't run away from it like so many isolationists in the government did at the end of World War I. The United States spearheads the creation of the United Nations, which is formed in 1945 and is to this day headquartered in New York City as an arbiter of international disputes and maintains a peacekeeping force. And America becomes very active in global politics throughout the latter half of the 20th century and into the modern day. And this manifests itself the most in the Cold War, which we'll be going over in this class later on if you're one of my students. Economically, the United States does suffer a little bit of a recession in 45 and 46, and of course they would pretty much have to. The economy had nowhere to go but down in terms of its size because it had become so huge during the war. But unemployment never rose to a massive level that you would think of with a recession. It's just that unemployment was down to virtually zero in the wartime years, and unemployment rose to about 5% in 1946-47. So it seemed like it was super high, but unemployment for the 10 years after the war sort of hovered between 4 and 7%. That'll do it for today. Feel free to post questions in the comments, and if you're one of my students, feel free to ask questions in class. Cheers.